for the third session of the. So all of you are relaxed now after having a delicious meal. So let's start. Just because you are eating healthy, it doesn't mean you can't sometimes enjoy a delicious dessert. After all, it's not the sugar or the fat content in a dessert that makes it great. Now we have with us Chef Bhuvan Ravishankar. May I request Chef Sachin Wilfred to introduce Chef Bhuvan Ravishankar, who would be speaking on delicious pastry or healthy pastry, the future. Over to Chef Sachin.
Thank you, ma'am. A very good afternoon to all of you once again, respected doctorates, professors from prestigious institutions, universities, colleges, and my dear colleagues. Once again, I would like to welcome you for the next session of our faculty development program. This time, it is going to be on one of my favorite topics of the day, which is delicious pastry or healthy pastry, the future. I am certainly sure that all of you who love desserts would have encountered this question at least once in your lifetime. To discover this, we have Chef Bhuvan Ravishankar with us, all the way connected from Australia. So make sure to have your coffee mugs close by to keep you active for not just the last, but the most interesting session for the day. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Chef Bhuvan Ravishankar to all of you. Chef Bhuvan Ravishankar specializes in bakery with an extensive experience of 12 years in areas of pastry, chocolate, and bakery production. He holds a bachelor's degree in hospitality management from the Welcomgroup Graduate School of Hotel Administration, Manipal. He is also a postgraduate in kitchen management program from the OCLD, which is the Oberoi Centre for Learning and Development. Chef started his career as a senior kitchen executive at Oberoi Hotels and Resorts, Mumbai in 2008. He also worked as a pastry chef at Oberoi Hotels and Resorts, Mumbai and Bengaluru until 2018. In September 2018, he moved to Melbourne, Australia, where he obtained permanent residency. In September 2000, he worked for the Atlantic Group for a brief period of time, and he currently works as a pastry chef at M Gallery, Hotel Shardstone and Pullman, Melbourne on the Park. He handles the pastry and desserts at 419 Key Properties for restaurants and banqueting operations. His hobbies include photography and traveling. Apart from this, he has kept himself fit and stunning over the years. In fact, now I can see only half of Chef Bhuvan to what I saw him a few years back. Without further delay, I want to welcome Chef Bhuvan Ravishankar to take over the session and share your views on the topic. Over to you, Chef. Chef, you have to unmute your mic.
Thank you, Chef Sachin, for introducing me, and it's been a great honor to be on board and to share this platform with esteemed participants. It's glad to be able to speak on certain topics which is really dear to my heart, which is being something healthy, like Chef Sachin mentioned, which is really sort of driven me over the past years. I mean, it's good that people are considering being healthy as one of the lifestyle changes. So there we go. I mean, I'm talking about delicious pastry today, and let's just combine the two, something tasty and trying to be something healthy together. So
Looking forward to it.
On the first slide.
Yes, the technical team is on it.
Okay. So in today's session, when we go to the next slide, just a brief overview of what we'll be talking across today. Can we move to the next slide if you don't mind? Yeah. We will be talking about certain topics which we will be touching point and going in depth details of certain topics which I will be doing in an hour and a half presentation. We'll be talking about Ayurveda, which is the basic concepts of Ayurveda and how they can be adapted to our day-to-day living, and what is the science behind particular ingredients. End of it, it all belongs to those ingredients which actually really matter, to which we consume. And what are those golden ingredients which we need in bakery and patisserie to be able to develop a particular product, and what is it derived and what is the calorific and what is the science behind it, and what are the healthy alternatives. If you're going to omit certain things, they have to have certain healthy alternatives. What are the healthy alternatives, and what can be replaced what with, and what are the trends happening in nowadays in modern patisserie, world of patisserie. So these are some of the topics which we'll be talking. And then the last thing we're talking about is some more modern substitutes. There's certain things which are being modern innovations which are being used in today's world of patisserie, which really involve replacing certain things with certain ingredients which give the same desired end product. So we'll be talking about some of these topics in today's session. To start with, let's start with Ayurveda. On the next slide, please. Uh, Ayurveda is, like many people understand Ayurveda being a very revolutionary age-old healing system. So it's hard to explain to the Western world what Ayurveda is, and they've not probably come up with an equivalent explanation as to why certain things are comprised of a particular manner, because these are certain things which are sort of years old of findings. What is Ayurveda? When you talk about Ayurveda, it's basically constitution of an individual which remains unaltered during a lifetime, and they're basically genetically driven. So when we say we belong to a particular dosha, Ayurveda has three different doshas, which is Vata, Kapha, and Pitta, right? So when we talk about these three doshas, a human being is solely not belong to one particular dosha. A person cannot be a Vata, cannot be a Kapha, cannot be a Pitta, but merely a combination of either three of these, right? And predominantly, there is a tendency towards one or more. So I can be more of a Vata and a Kapha, or someone else can be a Pitta and Vata, right? So this balance of three doshas, the three doshas which is there, the balance of three doshas is necessity for a healthy body. So when we understand, in the next few slides, we'll talk about what is Vata, what is Kapha, and what is Pitta, and what are the food which revolves around them. What is the bodily structure, and what food suits them, and what is recommended, and what does harm. And when we talk about these three doshas, at a very young age, the animalism or vata is very high. This is because of the physical growth and development of an individual. Because as a child, when you grow up, the physical growth is really important. So the child is predominantly towards the vata dosha. As we grow up, adults, the metabolism or pitta is predominant. Why? Because the body has matured and is stable. So that is where the bodily, teenager, post-teenagers and adults, most of us fall in pitta, because most of our body development is done. And people who grow a little older, the catabolism or the kapha is predominant in the body. As the body process slows down as we age. So these are the three doshas in which, based on age. Now, yes, it depends on what, like I said, it depends on how you're born. When you're born in a particular dosha, that predominantly stays right throughout your lifetime. And certain changes, combination keeps happening over a period of time. So let's talk about individually about these doshas and what is important and what we need to consider in terms of dietary and how does it affect us. On to the next slide, please. Here we'll be talking about the principle of vata, which is that which moves, the principle of movement. In terms of when you talk about the principle of movement, it is basically translated into the bodily air. It's not the air which moves around us, it's the bodily air which transforms the energy to the biological movement. So when you talk about this, what are the characteristics of people who belong to the vata group? These are the people who are relatively very creative, active, alert, and restless. They talk really fast, walk fast, and get fatigued very easily. So those are the people, these are the characteristics of people who belong to the vata dosha. These people are usually have short memory, but very quick understanding. They comprehend things very fast, but if you ask them after 10 minutes, they probably will not remember what you said. So that is one of the characteristics of people belonging to vata dosha. So what are the things which vata controls? Vata basically controls the breathing. It controls the blinking of the eyelids, the muscle movement, the pulsation of the heart, feelings of emotion. nervousness, fear, anxiety. And what does it affect? Digestion, nutrition, and skin color. So these are the things which are very predominant in a Vata dosha. And if some of the Vata, when you say Vata is high in a body, that means what are the body parts which sort of it gets affected most is the large intestine, the pelvic, the bones, skin, ears, and thighs. So this is basically Vata, and the people who the character some of the characteristics what we spoke about is what are the people who can fit into this category. When you try to fit yourself in that, you might be able to fit yourself in either one of these three or a combination of either three of them. So we'll talk about the next dosha, which is Pitta. When you talk about Pitta, Pitta is the principle of fire, heat, that which governs the bodily heat or energy that drives within our body. So when you say Pitta, people usually tend to have a Pitta bodily structure. They usually have a good appetite and they can digest larger quantity of food. They can consume more amount of food in a short duration of time, and usually they have a tendency towards sweet, bitter, and astringent tastes. So when people usually say I like to eat sweet food, that's probably because they fall into this Pitta dosha. And these people who fit into Pitta are usually have a tendency to perspire more, and they cannot tolerate sunlight. So these are all certain things, age-old traditions which Ayurveda has defined people. And why does it happen in a particular way? There is no clear explanation. But that is, these are some of the characteristics which define people and either fit people in either three categories. So when you say Pitta, what is the biological thing which affects Pitta is basically the digestion, absorption, nutrition, metabolism, body temperature, and skin color. And excess of pitta in someone basically shows in terms of anger, hate, jealousy. And where does this usually seen? Seen in terms of fat, eyes, skin, sweat glands. These are the places where pitta affects most. So you have what are the characteristics of people? What does it do in a particular humanly body? And if it is excess, where does it affect? And in the coming slides, we'll talk about what are the food which aggravate and what suits these people. So that gives us a clear understanding of, okay, I fit in a particular dosha, and these are the foods which aggravate the dosha, particularly cause high amount of pitta, high amount of kapha, and then what are the foods I need to avoid. So it's good to understand this when you design menus. When someone says, okay, I have this tendency, you know, that's probably this person is based on this particular category, he has to avoid this particular food. So that's one understanding principle thumb rule. On the next slide, we talk about kapha. Let me go to the next slide, please.
Just give us a few seconds, Shiv. I think it's got stuck in between.
So when you talk about these three different doshas, so it's basically understood that either one of each individual falls in either three of them. So basically, to summarize what we've been speaking is in terms of what are the foods which we'll be talking about later. This is basically a clear understanding of what are the doshas, where does it affect, and what is the energy or the principle which drives among each one of these doshas. So you can have, I can have kapha and pitta. Someone else can have pitta and kapha. So these are basically a combination. It could be a combination of 2-3 structures which work together and comprise of a individual. Do you want to go back?
It's got instruction. Yes, Chef, it's here.
Yeah. So the last one which we talk about is kapha. Kapha is basically the principle of hydration, which is called the biological water. So biological water, every human being, every living thing depends on hydration, depends on water. So the body water, the constitution of this physical structure is basically biological water, like I said. It maintains the body resistance and help heal the wounds, right? People who belong to kapha usually have low digestion. The digestion is very slow, and that's the reason why the less intake of food. Unlike the earlier dosha, which you saw, people have a tendency to have food faster and consume more food. This particular group of people usually have less amount of food. And what is the tendency? They usually tend to have more pungent, bitter, and astringent flavors. So they don't like sweet food. Like if you looked at the previous set of group, they don't like sweet food. And what are the things which basically affect this group of people are heals wounds, moisture, memory retention, energy to heart and lungs, and immunity. So the immunity is something which is driven by this particular group set of people. And chest is where the kapha sit. When you say someone says you have a high kapha, means the chest is where basically this set of it affects most. And in case of excess, it tends to sit more on the throat, head, ears, sinus, and mouth. So basically, when you look at an ENT perspective, ear, nose, throat, and then the chest, this is where it affects most. So in the next slide, we will talk about the food. Coming to the food perspective as to what food is recommended, what foods aggravate. To understand this, you need to understand, have a clear understanding of certain things. Food can be sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and astringent. Certain food types suit a particular set of people. Food can be light or heavy. It can be cooling or heating based on the ingredients what you use. And again, the fat can be
Sir,
oily.
how do you have to submit the quiz like
I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt, Shep. I think there was a technical glitch. You can carry on, Shep.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And also you need to understand that this is just a guideline of what foods are recommended for a particular set group of people. It is also depends on Ayurveda also defines when the food is consumed. It's not about what food you consume, how much you consume. It also defines what time the food is consumed. Like for example, a certain set of a group of people, like for example, Vata, maybe the body doesn't suit you having food late before you sleep. So these are all the things which you need to consider when you Ayurvedic definition. Like for example, when you look at Vata, when you look at the fruits, what Vata is good for a person who has Vata constituency to have is banana, avocados, mangoes, apricots, and plums. Whereas vegetables, asparagus, beets, and carrots, they suit the most. So there's some list of spices like cardamom, cumin, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, mustard, because this constituency is cooling. So when you look at the spices, they're predominantly which cause heat, warmth. So it's basically a balance. That's the reason why those particular things are recommended. When you look at fats, ghee, extra virgin olive oil, ghee is obviously calling heating. So because the body is cooling and light, you need warmer foods to constitute your body. Sweet, they usually people belong to Vata constituency prefer suits the body suits more unrefined sugar. So when you talk about desserts, okay, when you become someone who's of a Vata, you would rather not use white sugar or refined part of sugar, rather use unrefined raw sugar like jaggery, palm sugar. When you look at Pitta, the fruits are like grapes, melons, cherries, coconuts, avocado. Vegetables, again, asparagus, cucumber, potatoes, these are some of the recommendation of what are the vegetables which suit them the best. And even spice, when you look at spices and fats, even when you look at fats, it's basically oil, sunflower oil, and coconut. So ghee is not recommended because pitta is basically body constituency is heat. So you not substitute a heat component in the body. So obviously olive oil, sunflower oil is something which is recommended. In terms of sweet, it says avoid heat, avoid honey because honey is causes heat in the body. So this is something which you need to consider. These are the things mainly from a sweet perspective as we're talking about desserts right now. And when you look at the kapha one, which is heavy, oily, and cold, honey is recommended. So when you say I'm having a nasal, when we spoke about kapha being the ear, nose, throat, and chest, honey is recommended. So that's the reason why they say you have ginger tea or with honey and things like that. There's a reason behind it. So this is basically just a theoretical example as to why certain foods suit a particular group set of people, and this is just a basic guideline which we can follow. In the next slide, we will talk about certain golden ingredients. What are these golden ingredients? Like from a patisserie perspective, these are some of the basic ingredients which are required to sort of create a particular dish or a particular dessert per se. Like, for example, when you look at fats, sugar, eggs, flour, dairy, and chocolate, each of them have a particular role to play in a recipe. You can substitute them with something else. Sometimes you need a combination of both of them to create something. You can take out the third element, but you still need the other two elements for it to work. For example, you can take out flour and make a sponge with egg and sugar and almond meal. So you can make a flourless sponge. Or you can take out eggs, you can and butter from a recipe and use oil and vinegar with leavening agents to make a sponge. So you need a combination of one or two. Plus, in today's like looking at dietary perspective, you can take out butter, you can take out sugar, you can take out eggs, but you need to substitute those core competent ingredients with something else with those characteristics which help the particular recipe. So we're going to talk about each of these ingredients in the presentation as to how they are going to, what are the role they play, what are the healthy alternatives, and what's the modern substitutes what people are using to substitute them in recipes. So this picture is basically a picture which we had done recently, which I had done quite a long time ago actually, which was actually a mock imitation of the different ingredients. Like for example, the sugar was made from a marshmallow, the butter was made from a popcorn parfait, and the almond meal which you see is basically made with a snow, so which resembles flour, and then you have milk, which is basically we'd made a almond milk sort of a thing, and then you have egg, which is out of chocolate. So this is basically a pictorial representation of how the ingredients can fit on a plate, which is actually shows the golden ingredients which we use in patisserie. So we'll talk about fats in the next presentation. Talking about fats, fats is who doesn't like butter, who doesn't like oil, who doesn't like ghee. I mean, there's some of the things which are really vital for a recipe, and if you can't substitute them with, you can substitute them with certain ingredients. Yes, will they be the equivalent? But they will not probably be the same equivalent. But yes, they will. You can change the recipe by based on what are the characteristics or what role they play. So in the next slide, we'll talk about what are the roles of fats. Like in these uh, uh, fats, what do they do? For example, fats, the biggest role in a recipe is richness. They add high amount of richness to doughs, sponges, and cakes. Uh, Flavor comes obviously from the dairy perspective, the high amount of butter and leavening. What is leavening? Leavening helps us to for sponges and cakes, and it also helps in tenderizing and moisture. It gives moisture to the cakes. Like if you have a recipe with no butter, you obviously understand you remove the fat content from that particular recipe. So obviously you're going to lose out that perspective of fat from a recipe, but you need to understand that you can replace, there are alternatives which you can use to replace the fat in a recipe with something else. We'll talk about in the next slide, what are the classification of fats. Fats can be classified into two main categories. They are basically the unhealthy fats and then the healthy fats. What are the unhealthy fats? Unhealthy fats are basically saturated and trans fat. The saturated and the trans fat are basically the unhealthy one, which are predominantly which cause health problems. And the healthy fats are the mono unsaturated and the polyunsaturated fats. They are considered the healthy ones. So we'll talk about in the next few slides as to what they particularly mean, how they derived, and what fats fall into which category. So this is basically an understanding of how broadly perspective fats fall in. And in the next slide, we talk about sources and their health impact. So when you say source of a particular fat, it basically determines as to how does it come into being. For example, saturated fats are mainly found in animal products. like butter, for example. Trans fat, when you look at trans fat, they are not found in nature. They are a byproduct by the process of converting healthy oils into a solid fat in the process of factory, in a factory production unit where the oils are converted into fat. Examples like margarine, dalda. Why are they made? Because A, they're cheap, a cheaper substitute to butter, to the saturated fats, and B, they prevent the bakery goods becoming rancid. Like for example, butter gets rancid very easily, whereas dalda and margarine do not get rancid very easily. So they're excellent to make puff and other bakery baked goods because they're cheap, they give the same properties of what butter does, and they don't get rancid. Saturated and trans fat, in the other hand, prompt creation of, we'll talk about what lipoproteins. Low density lipoproteins are basically cholesterol in a human body, that which basically causes coronary artery diseases, right? So saturated fats, like you said, spoke about them being the unhealthy fats. They have a negative to it, that they cause cardiac problems. Good sources of, now we've spoken about the unhealthy. Now let's talk about the healthy fat. Like for example, talking about monounsaturated fats. What are the fats? Like olive oil, canola oil, avocado are some of the monounsaturated fats. And what is polyunsaturated? We spoke about monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are basically omega-3 and omega-6. These are some of the fats which are really healthy. That's why they say you need to have fish, cod liver oil, you need to have avocado. So these are the things which are present in these, naturally present in these ingredients. When you talk about omega-3 fatty acids, why is it so important for a human body to have these fats? They're essential fats which the body cannot make, right? So they reduce the risk of blood clots and inflammation. And that's the biggest concern we had with butter, because they cause coronary artery diseases. So these fats are healthy, the body cannot make, so we need to substitute by consuming them in the body. What are the sources of these omega-3 fatty acids? Are basically fatty fish like salmon, sardines, walnuts, and flax seeds, right? So I recently saw a series on Netflix which was said Seaspiracy. If I don't know if you've seen the series on, talks about a latest series on Netflix, which says omega-3 fatty acids are not predominantly present in fish. It's actually present in the algae, and the seaweed, which is present in the deep beds of the ocean, which the fish consume. And that's when people consume fish saying, I want omega-3 fatty acids. So if you're looking from a vegetarian or a vegan perspective, the highest source of omega-3 fatty acid is your seaweed and your algae, right? So that is something which you need to consider for a fat perspective. From an omega-6 fat perspective, is basically, what does it do? It prevents nervous disorders. The sources for highest omega-6 fatty acids are soybean, corn, sunflower, and sunflower oil. So these are the fats which are healthy. That's why they say canola oil is good for you. The reason being, it cannot be that omega-6 fatty acid cannot be made in the body. You need to consume it by some other source. And the last but not the least, we talk about cholesterol. So what is cholesterol? We all come to an understanding saying that certain foods are very high in cholesterol, which are bad for the human body. What is it? It's a type of waxy type of fat or a lipid, which basically moves through the body in the form of, in our blood, which is immiscible. Basically, it does not dissolve or mix with the blood. It forms clumps through the arteries, and basically it blocks the arteries. That's why when you say foods are high in cholesterol, that means your lipids are high in your bloodstream. What is cholesterol? Cholesterol moves through the body, which is carried through lipoproteins within the body. There are healthy cholesterol, and then you have unhealthy cholesterol. So low density lipoprotein, like we spoke earlier, they are called the bad cholesterol. That's the cholesterol which affects the cardiac problems. High density lipoproteins are called the good cholesterol. So you need to understand that when you talk about cholesterol, certain amount of cholesterol is required for the human body. What are those cholesterol foods which cause good amount, like peanuts, for example? They have good amount of cholesterol. Excessive, yes, they will cause problems. So this is very important for us to understand in terms of a fat perspective. What are the healthy fats? What is the unhealthy fat? What can I take? If I lose out, if I don't use butter, butter gives these things in a recipe, but if I use oil, I will not be able to get the exact characteristics what I need, but you compromise somewhere, right? So since we're talking about healthy desserts, these are the things which you need to consider from a fats perspective. In the next slide, we will talk about what are the healthy alternatives. Like we spoke about oils being used, coconut oil, rice bran oil, canola oil, olive oil, and plant-based butter. Now, most of all the recipes, people, the new trend of having plant-based desserts, people use plant-based butter, which is basically you can use nut-based butters. Like for example, peanut butter, almond butter, hazelnut butter. So these are the substitutes which you can consider. In the next slide, we'll talk about sugar. Considering sugar, so let's talk about sugar as to what sugar is all about and how does it affect us. In the next slide, we'll talk about what is the role of sugar. Sugar has certain characteristics which define its use in a recipe. Like for example, it gives crispness, it gives moisture and tenderizing in a recipe. Sugar adds color. The caramelization of sugar is used in many of the recipes. Sugar adds sweetness. The main reason why sugar is being used is for sweetness. And the last thing and the most important thing is preservative. Sugar acts as an excellent preservative for most. That's why most of the jams and all these high sugar foods are stored at room temperature for a predominantly long period of time. And they can still stay without getting spoiled because they have a high amount of sugar. In the next slide, we'll talk about what are the classification of sugar. What is sugar? Sugar is basically a form of carbohydrate. Every body converts food to glucose. When we consume food, it's converted into glucose. And these glucose carbohydrates come into two forms, which are basically a simple sugar and a complex sugar. The difference between two is when someone says it's simple sugar versus a complex sugar is based on how quick they're digested and absorbed. Sorry about that. It's different
Excuse me,
between the
Chef.
two. No worries.
Sorry to interrupt, Chef. I would request all the participants to make sure your mics are on mute. And you could put any questions on the chat box, not to unmute yourself till it is instructed. Thank you so much. Please carry on, Chef.
No. When you talk about simple sugar, when you talk about two forms of sugar being simple sugar and complex sugar, the difference between is how do you differentiate is how quickly they're digested and absorbed in the body. And this is basically determined by the chemical structure. So simple sugar, simple carbohydrates have composed of either one or two sugar molecules, whereas complex ones have more amount of complex sugar molecules. That's why they're called complex sugars. What are the common examples of certain sugars which we use on a day-to-day basis? Is basically glucose, which is the simplest form of sugar. Then you have fructose. So where is fructose present? Fructose is mainly present in fruit. It's called a fruit sugar. When you call sucrose, what is sucrose? Sucrose is basically other name is the table sugar, which is found like we use on a day-to-day basis. And the last one being lactose, which is the dairy sugar, which is present in most of the dairy products. So this is basically understanding of the types of sugar we have and how is the classified based on how they're absorbed into the body. And the last one, how do you measure sugar? Measuring sugar is done through something called as a glycemic index. Glycemic index is basically refers to how fast the carbohydrate is broken down and absorbed into the bloodstream. Foods which are high GI, it's called as a GI index. Foods which are high in GI index get in quickly into the food, causing high amount of glucose. That's why when they say certain foods cause a very sugary foods, they get into the bloodstream very fast and converted into glucose. So the amount of glucose in the body is very high because it's absorbed very faster. So that is how we understand sugar. And in the next slide, we talk about what are the alternatives for sugar. So what can you use to replace traditional sugar? And yes, obviously certain amount of sugars have less sweetener compared to the traditional sugar. Like for example, coconut sugar is derived from the sap of coconut palm. What are the health benefits of having coconut sugar? It has iron, zinc, calcium, potassium, as well as antioxidants. It has sorry, I think we have a question. Mainly, I think sugar we have with coconut sugar, it has lower GI index than regular sugar. We spoke about food being absorbed very fast into the bloodstream. Coconut sugar gets into the bloodstream slower than uh, regular sugar, which is the table sugar, what we spoke about. Honey has antioxidants and contains fructose. Maple is derived from the sap of maple trees and antioxidants has more antioxidants than honey. That's why they say maple is healthier than honey. Like when you talk about from a plant-based perspective, when you're doing a plant-based menu, like for example, a vegan menu, you can use maple because maple is derived from plants. Whereas honey, you use bees are involved in making the honey. So plant-based perspective, maple is an example for what you can use. And also stevia from plants, which is a sugar substitute which is used, which can be used as a substitute, as a healthy substitute. Date syrup used in many recipes. Date syrup is basically it gives the thickness as well as the sweetness for most of the recipes. And when you look at the sugar percentage, for example, if you look at a baseline of sugar being 100% sweet, brown sugar is 97% sweet than regular sugar. Fructose, which is basically present in fruits, and is 130%. Glucose is relatively less sweeter. So sugar is basically, glucose is 50% sweeter than regular sugar. And honey is, like I said, it's sweeter than regular sugar. Honey is 125% sweeter than normal sugar. Whereas maple, which is considered the best, is only 60 to 70% sweeter than regular sugar. So it depends on what recipe you're using. What is the best particular substitute? Yes, unrefined sugar, sugar which has uh, been through less processing, is the safest and the most healthy compared to the most refined sugar. We talk about eggs in the next slide as to what eggs mean in terms of as a dairy substitute used in many recipes. Eggs play a very important role. In the next slide, we talk about what are the role of eggs. What do eggs do in a recipe? Eggs basically help the structure and stability in baked goods. They help thicken sauces and custards. They emulsify custards, aerate sponge, glaze baked goods, and give a good amount of moisture in cakes. So these are the main reason why eggs are being used. For example, if you're removing eggs from a recipe, you need to substitute it with something which gives the same characteristics. So for that, you need to understand what are the role the eggs play in a recipe and how is it going to impact my recipe. If I remove eggs from a recipe, it's obviously going to reduce your moisture. You will not get the glazed color what you need. You will not get the aeration from a sponge. You will not be able to have a custard which is emulsified and nice and glossy. So these are the things to replace. You need to understand these are the characteristics. And in the next slide, we talk about what are the health benefits of eggs. Like for example, you obviously, when you look at a calorific point of view, eggs have high amount of cholesterol, high amount of calories, but they also have a high amount of health benefits. For example, it has 40% of your vitamin D, folate, riboflavin. It has high amount of vitamins. I will come back to that. It also contains vitamins A, E, B5, B12, also known as iron and antioxidants. So these are some of the highest benefits of eggs in a recipe. In the next slide, we talk about what are the healthy alternatives. So in terms of eggs, the healthy alternative, someone said about a vegetarian. Yes, you can. There are healthy alternatives for eggs in a recipe. Like for example, using yogurt with baking soda. Baking soda always needs an acid medium to activate. So that's the reason why you use yogurt or vinegar. When you look at most of these pre-mixed sponges, when you get in a store, when you buy them, they usually they ask you to mix yogurt with them because they have baking soda. That's the only reason why they say, because it needs leavening to increase the volume, you need baking soda with an acid medium. Silken tofu is used as an alternative in cakes for eggs. Avocado, apple sauce, Mashed bananas are used. Flaxseed and chia seeds are also used as an alternative. So what are the new things people are using for as egg substitutes in recipes are basically there is a brand called Sosa which produces different ingredients, modern ingredients. We're going to talk about them in one of the later slides, which basically talks about there is a product called as a Soja Whip, Soja Soja Whip, which is a vegetable protein made from soya bean, right? So this is basically replaces the egg in a recipe. If you want to make a meringue from egg white and make a vegetarian meringue, you replace the egg white with a soja whip. It's a powder, you use it in place of an egg. It produces the same consistency of what a meringue would do, everything being same. And the next one being called a potato whip from the same company, which is also from a company called Sosa, which is a deodorized potato starch. It's vegan, it's plant-based. You can make sponges with it. It aerates, it increases in volume, all the characteristics of what an egg does in a recipe. So these are like soja whip, potato whip are some of the examples. These are the ingredients. If you get a hang of them, they're really good as a substitute for eggs. And what is the most easiest substitute for eggs, which is easily available? Yes, some of these which I mentioned might be difficult to procure. If you buy canned chickpeas in a store and drain the canned chickpeas, do not throw the liquid. That liquid is called aquafaba. Aquafaba is an excellent replacement for egg whites, which are used to make vegan meringue. That whips and gives the same consistency of what a egg white does. So aquafaba, soja whip, and potato whip are some of the examples. What if you want to get a similar consistency of what a replacement of egg white would do. In the next slide, we talk about dairy products. What are the dairy products and how they help us in a recipe? We talk about the next slide. What is the role of dairy products? How do dairy products help us in a recipe? Basically, there's something called as a Maillard reaction, which is basically caused by the browning, which is basically present, the protein and the lactose present in a recipe with the action of heat cause browning. That's why most of the biscuits sponge get its color from. Dairy products help the strength of dough or batter in a recipe. What do dairy products do? They also help increase volume, because when they help in retention of gas during baking, that volume is preserved during baking. They add fat and sugar contribution in recipe. Yes, the amount of fat in the dairy products adds to the fat percentage in a recipe. As a yogurt, for example, it is probiotic, it is a tenderizer, and like we spoke about baking soda used with an acid medium, it works excellent with baking soda in recipes. So when you talk about milk, what is basically milk comprised of? Milk has basically 87% of water, total solids of 13%, fat of 4%, lactose of 4.8, and minerals of 0.8%, right? So these are basically the constituencies. 87% is basically, can you hear me? No. Yeah, 87% is water, and the remaining is fats, proteins, lactose, and minerals. So dairy products also help the digestive health. For example, probiotics. When you look at Yakult, we're going to talk about certain examples in the end, like Yakult, yogurt, and some of these probiotics which we consume on a day-to-day basis. They have active bacterial cultures which have unique characteristics of maintaining the pH in our gut, in our body, and that is there are some healthy microorganisms which are required, which create a healthy gut environment in our body. And next one being bone health. Dairy products have sorry, I'm just talking about bone health. Bone health is basically dairy products help us to maintain a good bone health. The calcium rich food, like for example, dairy is very high in calcium, that helps us to maintain good amount of vitamin D and osteoporosis and prevent us from different health problems. Muscle mass and hydration, it is said to have good amount of, like for people who exercise and do a lot of exercise like weightlifting and sort of exercise, they consume whey protein in their recipe as a post workout drink, because they consider to develop a healthy lean mass in a body. So whey is something which can be considered to prepare, like for example, if you have an event of people who are coming, who are like sports team staying with you, they might ask you to make something. You can't, they probably cannot have whole milk, so you probably have whey protein snack bars, or probably have something made for them, made something specifically for them. So these are the things which you need to consider in terms of what milk is comprised of and what are the health benefits of milk and dairy products. In the next slide, we'll talk about the types of dairy products. So there are a wide range of dairy products available to us in the market. Like for example, when you look at liquid milk, milk can be, you can avoid, get them from different range of fat percentages. Like for example, whole milk is considered to be 3 to 3.5%. Skim milk is about 1 to 1.2 1 to 2%, and low fat milk is less than 0.5, 0 to 0.5 percentage of fat. Evaporated milk, which is the same milk where 60% of the water is removed. We spoke about water being 87% having water, 60% removed, you get evaporated milk. Condensed milk is almost the same as evaporated milk, where 50% of the water is removed and high amount of sugar being added to it, right? So it's concentrated high amount of sugar in it. So cream, again, we have heavy cream, which is 30 to 36% as percentage of fat. Light cream is 25 to 30%, and half is basically 10.5 to 18 percentage of fat. Like we spoke about probiotics in dairy products. Example is yogurt, natural yogurt. Again, in the market, you can get yogurt which is regular, low fat. Kefir is basically liquid yogurt. Yakult is an example of what kefir is, basically a probiotic supplement. When you don't consume yogurt, you can use them in as a direct consumption, or you can use them in your recipes. Greek yogurt is used in most of the recipes. A lot of people are considering Greek yogurt to be healthy. Why? Because most of the moisture is removed and it's heat stable. Greek yogurt is stable to heat and it is high in protein. But the only disadvantage of Greek yogurt is it is low in calcium, because the water is taken out, the whey is taken out, it is low in calcium due to the moisture removed. Then we have flavored yogurts, which are basically pot set. You can see them as pot set, or flavored churned yogurt. You get them as individual servings. Skyr, as written as SKYR, as but pronounced as skyr, is basically Iceland style of yogurt. It requires 4 times the amount of milk to make yogurt, but has 3 times the amount of protein. So when you look at the protein perspective, skyr is high in protein and a Greek yogurt is low in calcium. So these are certain things which you might want to consider in a recipe. And non-dairy yogurts, like you have a wide range of options of non-dairy yogurts, where in today you can find, like for example, a coconut yogurt, macadamia yogurt, almond yogurt. So these are some of the examples of non-dairy yogurt which you can use for a plant-based recipe. The next slide, please. What are the healthy alternatives? Like for example, when you talk about plant-based milk, like for example, soya, almond, oat, or plant-based yogurt, coconut, cashew, almond, oat example. When you select a non-dairy yogurt, for example, if you say, I want to make a plant-based, what are the things which you need to consider is, for example, most of them have sugar added to it to enhance the flavor. And because it's a plant-based yogurt or a plant-based milk, the calcium content is taken out because there is no dairy involved in it, which is vital for the health bones. And like for example, most non-dairy milks are fortified with it, so most of them have an additive of calcium added to it because they're not naturally present in the product. They have cost perspective, non-dairy milks and non-dairy yogurts are relatively highly expensive compared to a natural source, because there's a lot of process involved in making them, because they're fortified with calcium, with vitamin B12 and other good ingredients. Dietary needs. Certain things, like for example, a dairy plant-based yogurt will not be suitable for some people. For example, someone being lactose intolerant will need to consider a healthy alternative of plant-based yogurt, like some of the examples which we spoke about there. But if you're having someone who is allergic to dairy products and wants to have an almond milk, and also who is not allergic, then yes, you need to consider different options of making. Nowadays, it's very easy to make like I spoke about cost perspective, like making an almond milk is very cheap. All you need to do is soak your almonds overnight and then blitz them the next morning, or cashew, macadamia, or rice, whatever for the thing. It's easily, these are the things, knowing how you do it, you can easily do it by yourself by replacing them. If you're making it for one or two, like in a hotel perspective, when you have 100 guests, when you have 5 people who have dietary requirement, it might be too expensive to get a carton of 12 liters of milk. It's easy for you to make a small batch of almond milk and for them to make a dessert out of it. For that, you need to know what are the basic, like if you're taking it out, you substitute the something with yogurt. For example, give the yogurt with milk, give some nuts, and substitute the health benefits out of it. In the next slide, we talk about flour. Once we finish dairy, we talk about flour now. What is flour? And flour is basically, what is the role of flour? The next slide, we talk about what is the role of flour. What does flour do in a recipe? Provides the strength and structure in doughs and batters. So that's basically the building block of a recipe, like from the flour. What does it do? It gives the elasticity and extendability. When you make bread, the gluten is formed. It's a protein which is formed by the contact of water. When you give hydration, that's when gluten is activated. And then what does it do? It gives browning and coloring. Like we spoke about Maillard reaction in dairy products, the most of the browning is also responsible by the flour. And when a lot of people have been doing sourdough starters and preparing starters during lockdown, the reason being most of them are being using rye flour. Rye flour is which contains natural yeast. So rye flour is used to develop a natural starter for a sourdough bread and then used in a recipe. So yes, flour has natural yeast present in it. Some flours have yeast taken out of it because a refined flour, but a rye flour, for example, is an excellent source of natural yeast present in a flour. The next slide, we talk about what are the healthy alternatives of flour. To understand that, there's it's a debate you can have about whether to have a wholemeal flour or a bleached flour. Obviously, bleached flour is the most refined form of flour, whereas a wholemeal flour is a flour which has all the goodness in the wheat. And to understand that, we need to understand what the wheat is comprised of, the wheat grain. The whole wheat grain is made up of 3 different parts. One is the endosperm, bran, and the germ. So 83% of the wheat grain constitutes of the endosperm, whereas only 14.5% of the wheat grain is constituted by the bran, and less than 3% is constituted by the germ. Like when you talk about refined flour, like for example, maida, refined flour, when you talk about, it is only endosperm, which is part of a wheat grain. So maida is mainly constituted of endosperm, which still has certain nutritive properties like protein, carbohydrates, ions, and vitamins. But bran, on the other end, which is taken off from refined flour, like for example, a bleach, it's also called as a bleached flour, or a plain flour doesn't have bran, which constitutes of a wheat flour. Like for example, when you look at atta has bran in it. That's why the color you get out of a flour which is darker in color compared to a white flour, because there is a percentage of bran added to it. How does bran help us in a nutritive perspective? It has high amount of vitamin B, minerals, and dietary fiber. So that's why the reason why they say whole meal is safer or more healthier than a bleached or a plain flour. Most of the recipes people are using whole meal instead of the plain flour. And the last one being germ, like I spoke about, the germ, which is the least amount present in a wheat grain, is basically the embryo, the sprouting section of the wheat grain, which is just 2.5% of the whole wheat grain. But most of it is taken out in the processing. Why? Because it has high amount of fat, which reduces the shelf life. So if you keep the germ in a whole meal, it probably will get spoiled faster. So most of the germ is taken off during the processing, and that is why the flour relatively has a longer shelf life. Now, most of the bran and the germ is easily available in the market. You can buy them separately and add them to your flour. So, based by making your flour to be more nutritive compared to a plain bleached flour. So, when people say, "How do I do gluten-free flour?" Can you give me an example of how to make gluten-free flour? Yeah, you can make gluten-free flour. It's very easy. The simple ratio, something which I use is basically 2 cups of white rice flour, 1 cup of tapioca flour, and 1 cup of potato starch, and 4 teaspoons of xanthan gum, which we will talk about what xanthan gum is later. Chef Sachin, if you would like to just type this in the chat, it's 2 cups of white rice flour, 1 cup of tapioca flour, and 1 cup of potato starch with 4 teaspoons of xanthan gum. So this is when someone says, I want a gluten-free flour, you can use this flour. Not all recipes will work exactly with the same proportion of gluten-free flour. You will have to try and test the recipe to see how it works, because obviously you're removing the gluten from the flour. So with the constituents of these 4 ingredients. You want me to repeat the ingredients?
Yes, sure.
So it's 2 cups of white rice flour, 1 cup of tapioca flour, 1
Yes,
cup
chef.
of potato starch,
Potato
and
starch.
4 teaspoons of xanthan gum.
Done, chef. Perfect, chef. Thank you.
So this yields 4 cups of gluten-free flour. You can buy this commercially outside, but yes, it's good to know that when you buy, what is it made up of? You can make them in-house by substituting them with certain ingredients what you have with you. In the next slide, we talk about chocolate. Chocolate is one of my, I'm sure Sachin also enjoys this topic. It's one of the great ingredient used in patisserie, which constitutes of, is mainly a health perspective. In the next slide, we talk about what is chocolate. It's important to understand what chocolate is, how is it derived, how does it come from, and how is it made. There are nearly about 3,000 varieties of plants and trees, and Theobroma is the plant from which chocolate is made. Harvesting, where does chocolate come from? Chocolate comes from the 60 to 70 percentage of the chocolate in the world comes from Ivory Coast, which is south coast of Africa, which is also called as Côte d'Ivoire. Ghana, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, Papua New Guinea. India is also a great producer of cocoa. Indonesia. So these are some of the countries which produce cocoa. And for us to understand chocolate, like for example, there are different varieties of chocolate available in the market. Like you must have come across this word called as couverture. What is couverture? Couverture is something which is the premium chocolate, which is made from 4 categories of cocoa species, which is basically Criollo, Ariba, Trinitario, and Forastero. These cocoa beans are used to make this chocolate. Then it is called a couverture chocolate. A couverture chocolate must contain or must be made from these 4 species of cocoa, right? And we will talk about another chocolate which is usually commercially available called as compound chocolate. Technically, compound chocolate is not chocolate because it's a combination of cocoa with vegetable fat and sweeteners added to it. It is a cheaper substitute to couverture chocolate, which is a premium chocolate, and also it is more work to work in a recipe. Like you have to temper a chocolate to be able to work in a process, whereas compound chocolate you do not have to temper because it does not contain the cocoa butter. We'll talk about what is cocoa butter in the few slides down here. But compound chocolate is technically not chocolate. It is a cheaper substitute to couverture chocolate. It doesn't have to be made from the 4 species of the cocoa pods. When we're talking about understanding the process of making chocolate, the first and foremost thing is harvesting. Harvesting obviously happens from these 4, talking about these species of cocoa from these particular countries which we spoke about, like Ghana, Papua New Guinea, India. Fermentation is basically a process where you collect the cocoa beans. It's a fruit. You open it. Once you open it, the pulp is allowed to ferment. How does it happen? The fermentation basically adds humidity. By keeping it in a humid environment, the fruit develops an acidic flavor. This acidic flavor is very important for developing the flavor in the ultimate chocolate which is being produced. This is depending on the harvest and the conditions. So humidity is the most important necessity for a fermentation process. After fermentation, the next process is called drying. In drying, what happens? This is to stop the fermentation, to stop the development of the fruitiness or the acidity in the cocoa beans. Drying happens. Usually drying is done like in direct sunlight or in or in a factory perspective, you can use dryers to dry the cocoa pulp. And once the drying is done, you have a fermented product which is dry, which needs to be cleaned and roasted, which is similar like coffee. Like for example, when you compare coffee, the process may be more or less the same, but it depends on what the ultimate end product is. Now the cleaning and removing of the impurities happens, and once this is done, roasting is done. Roasting is done to develop a deep flavor and color in the chocolate, and to balance. By roasting, what happens? You adding caramelization, which adds bitterness. So you're balancing the sweetness and the sourness with the bitter balance here, bitter taste here. And the next one is the deshelling or winnowing, which is basically deshelling or the winnowing is basically done with the help of mechanical rollers to remove the outer husk, or sorting or grading is also done at this stage. You remove the shell, after roasting, you run them through mechanical rollers to remove the outer husk, and then you sort them to different categories of as to what the end product is required. And the next is grinding. Grinding is done to break these larger particles into smaller particles with the help of mechanical rollers again. And the last but not the least, is conching. Conching is probably, yes, I will talk about it. Conching is basically one of the main process. Like for example, when we spoke about couverture chocolate, conching is a process of smoothing or homogenizing the cocoa mass to produce chocolate. So this is basically, when you look at, like for example, an excellent substitute is like when you look at an idli wet grinder. When you look at a wet grinder, it has two mechanical stones running, and the chocolate is after grinding is added into these roller machines, which revolve over a period of time. And this machine is run for at least 72 hours in a couverture. So when you look at, a lot of people are doing farm to bean to bar chocolate, when you see it's a small machine of chocolate running it, it is this cocoa mass. The product which comes out of this is called as a cocoa mass, which is primary, like to make chocolate. And from a larger perspective, after grinding, the end product of a conched chocolate is supposed to be really fine. And one of the method to use to determine the final product is by using a micron to measure the size of the chocolate. So you have a cocoa pod which is fermented, dried, clean, roasted. After harvesting, then it's ground and conched. Conched is basically, it is made into a very, very fine paste. And during this process, usually they add additives like soya, lecithin, vanilla, and sugar is added to the process. So in the next slide, we talk about what is the chocolate terminology. When you say cocoa mass and percentages, we talk about cocoa butter. Then, for example, when you in the supermarket, when you buy chocolate, which says a chocolate is 70%, or I like bitter chocolate. Someone says I like bitter chocolate, which is 70%. No, I don't like bitter chocolate because I find it too strong for me. What does 70% mean? Out of 70%, 50% is the non-fat solids, which is the cocoa mass, which we just spoke about in the machine, which rolls, we get the end product after making a fine paste of the cocoa pulp after roasting and grinding. That one plus 20% of cocoa butter. So 70% chocolate has non-fat solid, which is a mass of 50% and 20% of cocoa butter. When you say 70%, then what is the remaining things present in the chocolate? That is sugar, vanilla, and lecithin. So these are the other additives in a chocolate. So when you say a chocolate is 65%, then obviously it will be 40 and 20, right? So this percentage is what determines the chocolate when you buy a chocolate. Obviously, the higher the percentage of cocoa mass, the more bitter the chocolate is. The more bitter the chocolate is, less amount of cocoa butter in it. What is that question? I'll speak about it. Yeah. And the next one is, Chef Sachin, will you answer the question later?
Chef, I'm making a note of these questions that's coming up at the end.
Okay. And once you have the chocolate which is passed in the grinder, when you make a fine paste out of it, when you get it, and that is called the cocoa mass. And when you press the cocoa mass and remove the fat which comes out of it, that is cocoa butter. And what is that mass, which is pressed mass, which is left over, which is nothing but cocoa powder, which is dried. Cocoa powder has a fat of at least 20 to 22% of fat in it, and a good cocoa powder is invariably reddish brown in color. What are some of the fine brands of chocolate which are available in the market? You have certain brands like Valrhona, Barry Callebaut, Falklin are some of the brands of chocolate available. These are all kosher chocolate brands available in the market. As of yesterday, there was a new innovation by a company called as Cacao Berry, which was a new chocolate which is called 100% pure cacao fruit, which was called Evo Cow, whole fruit Evo Cow, which was launched by a company called Cacao Berry, which was basically 100% cacao fruit. Like for example, the above chocolates what we spoke about, being adding sugar, being adding vanilla, being adding other flavorings. This chocolate was launched yesterday, in fact, by this company, which says it is 100% cacao fruit, sustainably sourced from Dominican Republic and the Ecuador region, and it has natural sugars from the fruit. So there is no sugar added in this chocolate. When you say organic and being health benefit, this is probably something which can be considered in terms of developing a whole fruit chocolate with no additives added to it. The next slide, we talk about what are the health benefits of chocolate. When we talk about chocolate, you need to understand the certain health benefits involved in chocolate. Mainly, chocolate is antioxidant. It helps in anti-aging, prevents heart diseases. That's the reason why they say some amount of dark chocolate is good for you. It lowers the blood pressure, protects skin from the sun. And yes, the most important thing is chocolate plant-based? Yes, dark chocolate is plant-based, because in the previous slide, when we spoke about milk chocolate and white chocolate, in milk chocolate and white chocolate, you usually have certain amount of milk powder, sugar added to it. So dark chocolate does not have any milk powder, any dairy products added to it. It's only chocolate, cocoa butter, and sugar. In the next video, we'll talk about, there is a company, I would like to use a lot of local ingredients and local artisanal producers around me in most of the ingredients. In the next thing, we talk about a company called as Naviluna, which is in Mysore by a friend of mine called David Bello. They make chocolate bean to bar. The whole process is made in the factory in Mysore. So this is a small clip for you to see how they make chocolate.
Creativity is not so much an action, something that we do. I think creativity is something that we all are. We are surrounded by creation. You will ultimately want to do something with that inspiration. Chocolate, like all food, is really a process of selection, development, and execution. And like all things, selection is really important. We have to start with great raw materials or great inputs, because we can't produce great chocolate without it. Flavors are an extension of ingredients, and ingredients are an extension of nature. For me, I'm really inspired by my environment, so I like to work with either indigenous or locally grown ingredients, be it jamun, be it jackfruit, even looking at the culture of food where we are, so working with local mithais like Mysore Pak. It's all part of sort of engaging with an ecosystem of flavor, and then bringing your own experience and your own background into it, and hopefully creating something new, unique. Original.
So that was an example of how local artisanal products are making chocolate and what are the benefits and how they're incorporating local ingredients in their chocolate and making something innovative in the market. In the next slide, we talk about nuts and seeds. What are nuts and seeds and how they're important in a recipe and how they contribute to a recipe. What are the benefits in the next slide of nuts and seeds? Nuts and seeds are basically mainly responsible for for example, when you talk about nuts and seeds, what are the benefits of nuts and seeds? They're usually used as essential oils, antioxidants, they lower the cholesterol, they're anti-inflammatory, they reduce health diseases, and they're really high in fiber. So what are nuts used in recipes for? Nuts can be used as a whole. For example, certain nuts being almonds, Brazil nuts, macadamia, hazelnut, pecan, walnut, cashew nut, and peanut. And seeds can be pumpkin, chia, flax, hemp, poppy, and sesame. These are some of the examples, like how they can be used and what are the applications. We talk about them in the next slide. Uh, in the next slide, we talk about the uses of nuts and seeds in a recipe. They can be used as a whole for a texture perspective as to using the nuts and seeds as a whole in a recipe, or they can be ground. Like for example, almond meal is used an example as an alternative to flour in a gluten-free recipe. So almond meal, hazelnut meal, it's simple. It's the same 100% almond ground into a fine powder. Paste, yes, we have a lot of paste available in the market, which we in the recipes which we use. For example, pistachio, almond, hazelnut. When you commercially buy most of these nuts, and it's important for you to see the proportion of the ingredient contents in the nuts. 100% means 100% pistachio paste means 100% pista is there in that particular product. If it says 90%, then the remaining 10% is sugar. So obviously, this is something which you need to consider, like from a health perspective, you're buying a paste. Like for example, a praline. A praline is basically caramelized nuts, which is ground into a fine paste. When you say hazelnut praline, when you say almond praline, when it says 50-50, means 50% nut and 50% sugar. So that is something which you need to consider. Like for example, you might want to reduce the amount of sugar in the recipe because this has sugar already. So it's important for you to understand when you're buying a nut or you're making a praline, that what does that thing contain, right? So that is something in terms of praline and the paste. Nut butters, yes, again, you can easily make a nut butter. Like for example, peanut butter can be made by roasting the peanut, removing the skins, and then grinding into a fine paste. You don't need to add any fat. The natural oils present in the nuts are enough to give the binding for the roasting. So this is something which can be used as a like for example, we talk about superfoods in the next few slides, where you example some of the superfoods which can be considered in the recipe. But yes, these are the things which nuts basically play an important role in the recipe, and these are the ways you can use nuts and seeds. In the next slide, we talk about superfoods. What are superfoods? Superfoods are basically foods which are not something which are new, which have been there for a very long period of time, but they are more coming to the market now because people tend to be health conscious and diet conscious. But these are certain things. Why are they very considered in high regard? Because they are high in nutritional density with minimal calories. So you can get high amount of nutrition by consuming less amount of calories. They have high amount of mineral, vitamin, and antioxidants. What are the examples of certain superfoods? Blueberry, goji berries, acai berry are some of the examples. And most leafy vegetables are superfoods because they contain high amount of iron. Like for example, kale, spinach, spirulina, and wheatgrass are some of the examples of superfoods. Tea is also considered to be higher amount of nutritional benefits because that's the reason why tea is used. Matcha is used uh, in most of the recipes in like sponges and cakes. You use matcha, and even wheatgrass. Like if you look at breakfast buffets at some of the hotels, you have a health section which usually have a juice bar sort of a thing which have superfoods there. That's something which people are promoting for people to have as a, it's more of a health stage or health section of the breakfast buffet. In the next slide, we talk about certain examples of certain superfoods. Me being in Australia, some of the things which I use here as superfoods which are local. Like again, what are the reason of superfoods is you don't need to spend money buying expensive imported products. You need to use what is around you, what is cheap and easily available, and what is indigenous. Indigenous is surrounding you and what is locally available. Some of the examples of indigenous Australian ingredients are Davidson plum, Kwangdong is another nut, lemon myrtle and cinnamon myrtle, which is a herb as well. Kakadu plum is an example. Finger lime, which I'm going to show you in one of the slides of what I made out of finger lime, is an example there. And rye berry is another example. So these are wattle seed. Wattle seed is also another example which is used as a flavor in parfaits and cakes and sponges. So these are the it's by a company called as Australian Superfood. So if you want to look up on the internet or on Instagram and check their page, they have a high amount of options available, so you can see that. And I would recommend, rather than buying things from overseas, from different countries, try and use what is available in your country, in your state, in your city, around you, with supporting local farmers and local people who make these ingredients easily available to you. So it's important for us to support these people around us, which are easily, readily available. Like, for example, ragi. Ragi is very easily available in India, like finger millets. All these millets they're coming back now because they have high amount of nutritional benefits versus calorific value in them. So these are some of the superfoods which we can consider in recipes. During my session, I'm not talking about recipes per se, but giving a recipe like this is a healthy recipe, you need to follow this spread or this. Recipes, you can find them everywhere. So it's about understanding the different ingredients. What are the constituents made up of? What is the benefit out of it? What is the health factor out of it? And what can I replace them with? This all correlates back to the first few slides where we spoke about Ayurveda. So what do the body need, and what are the ingredients we use in the patisserie, and how can we replace them with different ingredients? So in the next slide, we talk about what are the modern substitutes. In terms of modern substitutes, we talk about modern substitutes are not something which have been created now. So they have been there for quite some time. They're being used in different proportions now. Why are they being used? They're basically used for people have different dietary requirements. Like, for example, dietary needs are something which are growing very largely now throughout the world. The biggest being gluten intolerance. What is gluten intolerance? The person who's gluten intolerant cannot consume any form of wheat or wheat products, wheat or wheat byproducts. And the second one is a celiac. A celiac comes under the category of a gluten intolerant, which is basically a genetic autoimmune disorder. So some of these dietary needs are really high in term dangerous. Like, for example, even the facility where certain things are being prepared, if you prepare something which is gluten free for a person and give it to him, they might be, that's why when you see products, it says produced in the place which may contain traces of nuts or seeds. So it's important for you to understand that these are some of the dietary needs which people have, and you need to cater to them. And lactose intolerance is another dietary need where people cannot have dairy products. That is one thing which you need to consider. Nut allergic, all tree nuts, people cannot have any form of, some of these category of people cannot have any form of nut, regardless of what, even if it is so serious that even if it is some traces of it found in the recipe or in the food, it can be fatal. Shellfish allergy is probably one of the biggest allergy which is happening right now. And the last and few but not the least are religious beliefs and customs. There are certain people who have certain religious beliefs and customs, like, for example, the gelatin. That's why you have certain substitutes, which we're going to talk about later. Plant-based. The next dietary need is a plant-based. Now, the new trend is people being plant-based. Is it like, what can you substitute for them? What are the ingredients you can use to produce the same? Like, you can't, gone are the days where you can't give them a fruit salad or give them an ice cream with fruit salad. They demand more than what a regular guest pays. And sometimes now there are some restaurants which are focusing more on plant-based menus and desserts and menus on the restaurant than a regular menu. When you talk about these dietary needs, what is anaphylaxis? You must have heard of the word anaphylaxis. Is basically an allergic reaction caused by consuming something which you're allergic to. It can be really fatal, and people can lose their lives to these allergies. And this is basically caused by difficulty in breathing. If you see someone having difficulty in breathing, someone has a hoarse voice, wheezing, a cough, dizziness, or swelling of the throat, these people have, that means they've had an allergic reaction. They need to be treated ASAP. So this is some of the things why we are using modern substitutes. We have spoken about the traditional ingredients. I will talk about certain ingredients which are available in the market, like I spoke about the potato whip and the soja whip for egg white substitutes. In the next slide, we talk about something called as a xanthan gum. A xanthan gum, this is a company which I use. It's not necessary that you use this particular company. It's from a company called Sosa, which is from Spain. Xanthan gum is basically derived from fermenting sugar. It is again a plant-based product. It is used as a thickener and stabilizer. It creates viscosity and stability. It is used in cakes, sauces, soups, and beverages. So these are some of the xanthan gum is an example. In the next slide, we talk about gel creme hot. Gel creme hot is basically a refined cornstarch which resists high temperature and allows freezing. Where can you use them? You can make a white sauce with, for example, soya milk and make white sauce by using this. For someone who is allergic to dairy, you can make a custard by not using dairy. Someone who is lactose intolerant, I can make a custard with soya milk or almond milk by using gel creme hot. So these are the things which we can use to produce the same product, but with different alternative ingredients which we work around to get the same product, matching the same product. In the next slide, we talk about gel creme cold, which is the same as gel creme hot, but you don't need to heat the product. So this is something which is again modified potato starch. You can make creams, sauces, and custards. Cold custard, like for example, if you're serving a cold sauce with a dessert, and if you want to make eggless, you don't want to have egg, you can use cream, you can use flavoring, and you can use this product to thicken your sauce. Again, this is plant-based and which is made from potato starch. So there is no additives, there's no chemical additives in this particular recipe, in this particular product. The next one we talk about Goma Guar. This is again made from guar seeds, which is used as a thickening agent, which is stable to freezing. Sauces, pastry, and sausages, wide range of application from savory to sweet, which can be used. These are the things. The only thing with these products are they are a bit expensive, maybe difficult to obtain at some point in time. But once you get them, they are life-changing in terms of your production line. Like for example, it's easy to produce more variety to your line with these products. And the last one we talked about is
Chef, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Chef, we are running out of time, Chef. We have a few questions already. You can let me know when to start with the Q&A session, Chef.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go on to the quick one last week. Yeah. And let's go to the slide which has tasty or healthy. The next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, kappa is another ingredient which we can use as a gelling agent. Next, we talk about what can it be, the topic is, can it be healthy and tasty at the same time? Can it be calorie conscious? Can it be tasty? Can it be flavor driven, organic? Yes. These are some of the products which we spoke about. Yes, you can use them to make certain products like this. Like for example, you can have fish gelatin, which is not made from beef bones. You can make a vegan gelatin, agar agar, pectin. These are some of the things which you can use to make a product. Like for example, when you talk about certain restaurants like 11 Madison Park in New York by Daniel Hum, which is reopening after a year and a half after lockdown, several lockdowns, their complete menu is plant-based. So this is where the direction people are leaning towards. In the next slide, we talk about B concept, which is a concept by a chef called as Jordi Bordas. So what does he focus on? He basically retains the taste, makes it healthy and makes it lighter. What does he focus on? Fat percentage, sugar percentage, gluten, and the calories. The next slide, just give you an example as to what the B concept is all about. If you have a traditional recipe which uses eggs, sugar, cream, milk, and chocolate, his recipe replaces all of them by using water, a starch, using dark chocolate. So basically, what is he doing? He's trying to reduce the calorie from 300 to reducing to much lesser by producing the same amount of taste and the texture in the product. The next slide, we talk about just showing some examples of what the finger lime, what I spoke about, Australian indigenous products of a bush food was basically a finger lime tart which I made recently. Some of the things which you can use, incorporate superfoods in a granola bar when you make them, so you can use them in as a snack. The next slide, which is basically talks about the same finger lime which we spoke about being used, so that made a gel out of it. When you see on the right hand side, it's been a pulp. When you pull it out, you make a gel and then you mix it in a product which can be used in different applications. Next one we talk about, just to give you an example, you can probably get a copy of this from Chef Sachin and the team. This is basically an example of as to how you can work around plant-based recipe, what you can use, and some substitutes you can have towards particular products. So these are some examples. So like a tiramisu cake and avocado, like I spoke about, it has fat, it has sugar. So these are the things which you can incorporate in your recipes. And lastly, the last slide is that's a small quote. And there was during the beginning of what I did during the year and a half, almost a year of lockdown, was when I was at home, I was trying to create recipes which people can make at home and sort of recreate at home by using minimal ingredients and minimal equipment. So that's the QR code which I used last time, which you can scan, which takes you to my blog, and you can just log on to the blog and see how some recipes have been posted there.
Thank you, Chef. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry for
A
rushing.
few questions. Sorry, Chef?
Yeah. Sorry for rushing through the last.
No, Chef, totally understandable. The topic is so intense.
Yeah.
Chef, the question, I have made a note of some questions which was already popping up at the start.
Okay.
This question is by Ms. Kajal Maheshwari.
Mhm.
Canola oil and olive oil is not indigenous. Do you recommend it, or is it just a marketing gimmick?
Canola oil may not be, but sunflower oil is easily available, because canola oil is obviously depends on where it is grown and where it is product. Like for example, olive oil is definitely not indigenous. Olive oil is depending on if there are people who make olive oil and they sell even in the supermarket. When you say an extra virgin olive oil, when you compare it, when you pour it in a clear glass and see, it's not green. It's not the finest grade of oil. So it also depends on what is the quality, what is available, and what substitute you can do out of it.
Thank you, Chef. Thank you. The next question is by Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Gupta.
Okay.
As per recent research, rice bran oil is harmful for health. What are your views on that?
So rice bran oil, like for example, it all looks at, like I said, how fats are absorbed into the body and how their the chemical structure is. Like for example, any fat for that matter can have some harmful effect on the human body. Like it also depends on what proportion are you using it in. Are you using it? Is it using it in baking where you're heating it, or you're going to break down the chemical properties? These are the certain things which you need to consider. Like olive oil, canola oil, rice bran, these are some of the substitutes. You can't use them wholly in a recipe. It also depends on when you substitute. Whenever you substitute anything in a recipe, you need to try and see whether it really works. Maybe canola oil might not work really well when compared to a rice bran oil. So these are the substitutes which you can try and test and see.
Okay, Chef. The next question is from Dr. Pankaj Kumar. The question is whether sugar-free products are really sugar-free. What are your views? Is it really sugar-free, or is it just a myth?
It depends on, like I spoke about, like for example, the latest innovation as of yesterday, like we spoke about the chocolate, which is created by cacao berry, which is 100%, which talks about no sugar being added, the sugar being used from the chocolate, right? So that you can say it's 100%, and it's in fact a trademark name by the chocolate. Nobody can make the chocolate by that name. That replace the chocolate with something else and add sugar in it because it's patented. Like same thing, for example, sugar. When you talk about sugar-free desserts, they use sugar substitutes. They reduce the amount of sugar. They use sugar substitute like stevia and all equal. They are used in sugar-free desserts. They're not 100% sugar-free.
Okay, Chef. Thank you, Chef. Yes, Chef. So, Mr. Atin Das, he wants to know, he wants you to repeat the name of the chocolate that you said about 100% cacao berry.
So this one is by, just a second. This is called, when you go on Cacao Berry website, when you see, it's called the whole fruit Evo Cow, EVOCAO.
Yes, chef.
EVOCAO, which is launched as of yesterday. So you get the details of the chocolate there. You can see, look it up there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, chef.
Thank you.
That was a very intense session, starting from Ayurveda till the modern concepts that is being used, all the alternatives. So I
Yeah.
would like to conclude the session um, with a few lines, chef, if I may do that.
Yeah, definitely.
So the food we eat is the best medicine that we can give to our bodies when consumed right. The same food becomes a slow poison when it is not considerate. The same way, a little bit of sugar does no harm to you. So be watchful, know your food, and continue to enjoy your desserts in the right amount. Have a healthy lifestyle. I would love to render my sincere and special thanks to Chef Bhuvan for such an in-depth session on healthy pastry and explaining in detail with all those ingredients, alternatives, and benefits for a better lifestyle. I'm sure it was a fruitful and a healthy one for all of them here. I want to say a big thanks to all the lovely participants today for being so patient and amazing, and also Dr. Usha Dinakaran and the Department of Hotel Management for giving me an opportunity to share space with some of the best chefs around the world. Before we bid goodbye for the day, I request Dr. Usha Dinakaran to take over and give you all the required information that we need for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Chef Sachin. And thanks a lot, Chef Bhuvan, for
Thank
that
you.
very, very, very informative session. I think it was one of the, I think I went back to my college days to learn to know more about the bakery products, which the ingredients, I would say.
Correct.
So it was really a learning session for all of us, I think so. Thanks
Thank
a lot once again.
Thank you. That's the reason why I mainly focused on talking about the science rather than providing recipes. I think that gives an understanding. So
Yes, it was very, very informative.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Chef,
Thank
once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Same to you, Chef. Bye-bye.